let me get started because I have lots I want to talk about today. So today we're going to be talking about sequencing, theming, and teaching shorter yoga classes. So let me begin with my little introduction. So there's been a lot of evolutions in yoga since I first began practicing, maybe since you first began practicing. And one of the biggest evolutions is shorter yoga classes. So back in my early days of practicing, classes were usually like 90 to even 120 minutes. And these days, 60 minutes is much more the norm. But express classes, shorter classes, like somewhere between 20 and 60 minutes, are becoming much more popular, both in the studio or in the gym and in virtual or online classes. So today we're going to kind of ask the question, how do you take all the poses and all the flows and all the breath work and the meditation that you love and pack it into an express class and still have a well-rounded practice and a really rich experience of yoga? So what we're going to talk about is how to theme and sequence and facilitate 20 to 45-minute classes that still provides all the movement, the mindfulness, the meditation that students are looking for in a smaller package, in a shorter time frame, and hopefully without losing the depth of experience and meaningful relaxation that students benefit from. So let's dig in. So when you're teaching shorter classes, a really big part of your strategy is going to be about creating a sequence, something that's effective and balanced and engaging within that limited time frame. So let's talk about practicalities. So first, focusing on a theme or an intention. So choosing a theme or intention for the class might be focusing on a body part, like a hips focused class or a shoulders focused class. It might focus on like a skill, like a class focused on balance or ground to standing movements, or a class focused on a feeling or an experience like play or relaxation, right? Once you've chosen your theme, you can center your sequence around poses that align with that theme or with that intention. And that's going to kind of build the framework of your sequence, right? Before you start sequencing poses, you want to think about how you're going to incorporate breath work into that theme. So allocating time for breath work exercises. And that might be simple things like introducing Ujjayi breath at the start of class, or 3-part breath, or alternate nostril breathing. And those work well to both open and close your class. So what breath work is going to support your theme and is going to fit within your time frame and is going to support the movement techniques that you want to teach. So that's something to think about. Then you want to think about your warm-up. So you want to start your practice with a brief but effective warm-up that's going to prepare your students' bodies for the movements that you've planned, right? So that might include dynamic stretches, joint mobilizations, that are going to ready students for your theme or sequence. So what are the movements that you've chosen and how do students ready themselves for those movements? And it's particularly important if you're going to focus on stronger poses. You want to be sure that that through their warm-up, they're preparing for those movements, whether that be movements of deep hip flexion or movements of spinal extension. You want to make sure that your warm-up addresses specifically what you're going to be doing in your class, right? A general warm-up for a general class is great, but if you've got a 20-minute class focused on hips, your warm-up had better prepare those hips, right? And something about the opening of your class and warm-ups is that here, time management is really important. You might have already noticed in your teaching, you can lose a lot of time with your opening and warm-up. So you have to be really diligent in planning and facilitating the start of your class. Without even looking, your warm-up in your 30-minute express class could take 15 minutes. So you've really got to stay on top of time management for that opening. And so you want it to ready students and open the class and get people into the flow, but you want to make sure that it doesn't drag into the main body of your class. And I mean, because we're talking about vinyasa flow, we're going to talk about sun salutations or any kind of flow sequences. So you want to incorporate a few rounds of your sun salutations or flowing sequences to, build heat, to link breath with movement, to get students into the flow. And in those shorter classes, you want to be efficient with offering multiple accessible options within your sun salutations. And that could look a number of different ways. It might mean teaching 3 versions of a sun salutation. So version 1, knees, chest, chin to the ground, sphinx, puppy pose. Round 2, you might do modified plank, modified chaturanga, cobra. And round 3, you might do plank, chaturanga, up dog, the way that we generally do in our sequence. So you might do it that way, or you might offer all of those pose options within your sun salutation. So maybe you teach the first round a little slower, offer all the options within that round, and then students are making their choices. So you do want to think ahead of how you're going to offer accessible options within your sun salutations and how students are going to be able to receive and make choices about which versions they're going to use. If you're teaching a 20-minute class, I recommend using many more accessible options, just because students might not have the warmth, they might not have the warm-up time and the flow time and the education time to do stronger versions of sun salutation. So that's something to keep in mind. Next, consider the usual flow of your sequence. You don't have to reinvent the wheel when you teach a shorter class, although you could. But if you're teaching a general class, so like vinyasa flow, which is what we usually talk about, if you're teaching that in an express format, you can still rely on our general sequence. So in vinyasa flow, we have warm-up, sun salutation, standing poses, balancing poses, seated poses, strengthening and back bending, finishing poses, and shavasana, right? And you can largely stick with that sequence or that flow even in a shorter express class. But you might blend some sequences together as well. For instance, after a few sun salutations, you might start to blend some standing poses into your flow, right? So you can still stick with kind of the main structure or framework of your usual class, but you might blend some things together. Right? And one of the ways that you can blend things together is with your transitions. So in a short class, you're not just going to be programming pose, 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 pose. You really have to think about being efficient with transitions. So smooth transitions between poses is going to help you maximize the time you have and minimize downtime, right? If your class is about downtime, don't minimize it. But if your class is about flow, how am I going to get flow? And one of the ways you're going to do that is with your transitions. So you want to make transitions really efficient by blocking your sequences. So rather than moving from sitting to standing, back to sitting, you might begin a class standing, move to sitting, then reclining, and that's going to help reduce those big transitions from ground to standing, standing to ground. I also recommend considering turning transitions into techniques. So make your transitions count by turning them into a technique. So now my brain's empty, isn't it? Okay, so if you're moving from sitting to reclining, right, rather than just, lie down, you can do a few half rollbacks. So on your way down, coming back up to sitting, on your way down, coming back up to sitting, and then ultimately rolling down. You're turning that transition, which you would have made anyway, taking a couple of extra seconds to turn that into a core strengthening technique. And also a moment of education. How do we roll down onto our backs, right? It only takes a few moments to do, and it adds another element to your class. So you're turning that simple transition into another technique. So that's something to think about when you're programming to kind of maximize the short time that you've got with your students. Next, when it comes to your sequencing, I recommend having kind of a targeted asana sequence. that of course relates to your theme or intention. So, and depending on how you theme your class, in a 20 or 30-minute class, you can probably really only focus on one sequence or one pose flow. And then the rest of your class should focus on poses that kind of impact the whole body, and poses that complement or counter that sort of targeted asana sequence, right? So an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so imagine you have a class focused on preps and versions of crow pose. Your sequence is going to be focused on that targeted asana series. So you're going to maybe, and your warm-ups have to reflect the work that you're going to do in crow. So wrist warm-ups, hip warm-ups, preps like happy baby or garland pose, yoga squat, and then into your crow versions, right? So you've got your theme, your sequence, your targeted asana series, and then around that, have some poses that touch the whole body, which include things like sun salutations, right? Which use the whole body. And then poses that counter crow, which might include things like lunges, locust for hip extension, because you're doing so much deep hip flexion in crow. Maybe sphinx or cobra for the spinal extension that counters the spinal flexion of crow. And then you might even include like nice wrist cool downs or massage or stretches to ease out the work of the hands and wrists for crow. So if I've got 20 or 30 minutes to teach a class focused on crow, those are some elements I want to plan for. Things that are going to move me towards crow and then ease out crow. And then I want to make sure that there's moments in my class where the whole body is touched and where the work of crow is eased out or countered. Does that make sense? Next, consider multiplanar movement. So even in the shortest express class, you want to be sure there's opportunities to move on all three planes of movement. For those of you listening who haven't done your anatomy basic study yet, in brief, 3 planes of movement: sagittal, frontal, and transverse, right? So we want to make sure that we have a chance to move the big joints of the body, which I'll include shoulders, spine, and hips, on all 3 planes as best we can, right? So some efficient ways to do that include 3 spinal warm-ups. So like cat-cow, tail wagging dog, thread the needle. You could do that in hands and knees position. You could do that seated if that's how you're opening your class. You could do that standing if that's how you're opening your class, right? What are other ways to do that? You could add some side bending and twists to your sun salutations. And that might be in powerful pose, that might be in your warrior 1 pose. You could include multiplanar movement in your seated sequence or even in your finishing poses. So try to find ways to get off the sagittal plane, because trust me, it's very easy to accidentally sequence a whole class that does not leave the sagittal plane, right? Where every movement is on train tracks and we never veer off, okay? So I recommend, after you've designed a sequence, take an extra moment to review your sequence with an eye to looking at how you're using the body. Are the big joints, shoulders, spine, hips, are they getting a chance to move off the sagittal plane, right? So add that to your checklist when it comes to sequencing, to take one last look through, have I gotten a chance to move in all 3 planes of movement, okay? Next, you want to have time, even in the shortest class, to ease into rest. So you want to dedicate some time for finishing poses, to ease out tension, to reduce intensity, and to kind of guide the body mind into rest. You don't want to flow straight from a really dynamic sequence into, okay, now everybody lie down and rest, like after sun salutations or something, right? So you want to try to plan for a few finishing poses that kind of guide you organically into resting. Even in a 20-minute class, this should be possible. That might include like seated or supine reclined poses. You might include some movements that ease out common areas of tension, like hamstrings, hips, shoulders. And you might include some restorative poses, like child's pose or supported bridge or supported fish, right? Something that gives people a chance to move from a dynamic flow towards rest, right? And from a atmosphere perspective, you also don't want to go from really pacey technical cueing, talking your students through complex postures into the complete absence of your voice. You want to kind of go from that technical portion of the practice through moments of silence, longer moments of silence into rest, right? And those finishing poses and restorative poses that are a lot less technical, they require a lot less cueing, are going to give you those moments for some teacher retention and for students to drop in and have some silent experience to feel their bodies, right? As they move towards rest. So like you're telling a story as you move towards Shavasana, like now we're moving towards Shavasana. And that's going to have an impact on students' bodies and minds, and on the body brain chemicals that guide us to rest, right? So that's something to really think about and to really plan for. Even in the shortest class, you want to have some moments that tell students we're moving towards rest. Yeah. And then rest, meditation, Shavasana, guided visualization, whatever you're going to do. It's one of the biggest challenges in a short or express class is committing, not just planning time for rest or meditation, but sticking to that time, right? And so one way to do that is to sequence from the end of your class forward. So generally in styles like Vinyasa Flow, we would say 10 to 20% of your class is rest. So in a 30-minute class, 3 to 6 minutes is complete rest, right? Not including your finishing poses. That's total rest time. So block that out first and then start sequencing forward to ensure that you have that time. Now, as I say this, those of you who've studied with me for a long time, you know, I could teach a 90-minute class and still accidentally not leave time for a long, delicious Shavasana because I get excited about what we're doing in class, right? And that's really asana-centric thinking. So I have to continually work on myself to be Shavasana centric in my planning and make sure that I've left that good chunk of time for students to rest. So that's something to think about. Very, very easy to lose track of time in a short class and go, oh, okay, and everyone lie down and rest and and move your fingers and toes and stretch your arms and legs and roll to the right. And you like it happens, but you want to try to plan better than I do, okay? Because time management is going to be one of your biggest challenges, right? So you want to be prepared for things. Really practical strategies. Be prepared with props to reduce sort of downtime. Have students, if you're teaching face-to-face, have students gather all the props that they're going to need in advance of class. If you're teaching virtual classes, so you're live streaming online, have students gather up the props they're going to need and make the space that they need in advance of your class. So if you know students are going to lie on the floor with their arms wide, get them to make that space between the sofa and the coffee table in advance of the practice. Get them to gather up some pillows and blankets and, you know, a strap, tie, karate belt, hand towel, whatever they've got to use for a strap. Have them gather all that in advance so that you don't have students in the middle of a 20-minute express class wandering off around the house looking for something that's going to be useful for this particular pose, right? So be efficient and have people prepare the space and the props that they need. And then in your teaching, bring your props into your flow, right? So that they're there when you need them. So that might be in your cueing and you're demonstrating, like bring your bricks with you to triangle, flowing up, take your brick with you to the second side. Before you lie down, have your strap and blanket handy for this next sequence. So be proactive in your use of props so that you're not in the middle of a pose and then telling students, oh, if you can't reach your foot, you might use a strap. So then students have to go get the strap, come back, have an experience with the strap. It's going to stretch out the time for that sequence, right? So planning in advance. Say things like irritate me, but it does sort of, it is an irritant when I'm teaching a class and I've tried to really thoughtfully guide students through the practice and through their finishing poses into like a really deep and rich rest. And I've forgotten, or students haven't prepared their socks, their jumpers, their blanket in advance for Shavasana. So then you've got students popping up out of Shavasana and running around the room to get the things they need for Shavasana. And I feel like, you missed out on this experience of like slowly moving into Shavasana, right? And I want them to have that. So in order for them to have that, I have to make sure that they're ready so they don't have to pop up and run around in advance of Shavasana or in the midst of Shavasana because they're feeling cold or they didn't get the prop they needed. So that to me, like, to give people an experience, you have to kind of anticipate what they're going to need and when they're going to need it if you want them to have the experience that you've planned out, right? When you're teaching virtually, you can't control what's happening in someone else's house. So in the middle of Shavasana, the phone rings, someone knocks on the door, the kid runs through. Like, those are things you can't plan for. But you can plan your sequence and plan for people having the props and the tools that they need around them so that they can flow into a nice rest. Okay. Theme wants to connect with that targeted asana sequence that you're going to do. Your theme wants to connect with the breath work that you choose. It wants to connect with the way you warm up and how you close a class. You know, we want to think of bookending our class with our theme. We open with a theme, we close with a theme. So how might your time and relaxation also integrate your theme? So many ways you can do that. If you think about marketing shorter classes, whether you're teaching face-to-face, you're teaching virtually, or you're going to have some shorter classes in your online library that students can practice with anytime, how you name your class can kind of brackets around what kind of themes you can do. Now, Express is a pretty common name for shorter yoga classes. And those can be anywhere from 15 minutes, which is usually online classes or like corporates, or the general 30 to 45-minute express classes online, in the studio, in the gym. If you don't want to use the word express, you can use things like quick flow, energy express, short and sweet. Yoga snack, like you could call them yoga snacks. Some, we talk about movement snacks a lot, If you're creating online classes for your library, that's where you can get really specific. So 20-minute happy hips, 30 minutes breathe and balance, 45-minute fire flow, right? So you can get really specific if you're putting classes into your online library. So people are like, yeah, I've got 20 minutes for a class, and yes, I want to work on my hips. I've got 30 minutes, and yeah, I'd like to play with balance today, right? And that way students can choose really specifically. Whereas in the studio, if you're teaching live classes, you maybe have less options to be that specific because not every class is going to be a happy hips class. So I want to talk about having an experience of the depth of time when we don't have a good length of time to work with, right? Think about how we perceive time. We tend to think of time as being linear, like a long string, right? And when we have a shorter class, we have less the length of time. But we want to try to have opportunities for depth of time, right? Even in that shorter experience, for students to drop in. Right? Um, I think that with some thoughtful sequencing, with some considerate pacing, there are still opportunities for students to have a depth of time in a short class. I think some of the ways you can do that is find moments for silence. So in a short class, it can be really easy to just kind of show your students through a rapid fire sequence of poses where they never really get to feel and experience and drop in, right? So be looking for spaces where you can give students silence, where you can have quiet, where they can contemplate the movement they're in, the breath work they're in, the rest that they're in, so that they can drop in, right? And consider how your sequence leads towards a rich period of rest, right? Even if it's only for a few minutes. Yeah. So consider depth of time rather than length of time. And you might have your own experiences of teaching classes like that, or being in a class where you really feel like, wow, I really dropped in, and how did that happen? Finding space within this short time frame, it can feel like you're anxiously chasing the clock, and that's not the experience you really want to bring to your students, right? How might express or shorter classes fit into your weekly teaching schedule? Teach those long, delicious 90-minute, 120-minute classes. So keep going, keep doing that. You might pepper your weekly schedule with a few express classes, right? Or film some online classes that your students can have access to in between those long in-person sessions, so that they can keep enjoying practice at home, right? Generally, these days, people who are attending longer classes are coming less often to the studio. So you might want to have offerings for those short little offerings for students, so they have more frequency of practice, which we'll talk about in a moment, right? If you find that your students are eager for shorter classes, but you still want to offer some longer classes where you have more time and space to explore, you might schedule weekly or fortnightly or monthly, like yoga lab type classes, where you give yourself, 2 hours or so to teach a class, right? It's sort of a special class. And you could do that. That could be open to advancing students. It could be open to all students. It could be invite only, however you want to organize it. But it gives your students a little something extra in their week or in their month. And it gives you as a teacher more time and space to teach and educate and explore. If your most of your week is teaching 45-minute express, 30-minute online, 60-minute in studio, it can be nice to have those bigger chunks of time where you can do some educating, some workshopping. You have more time and space for things like breath work and relaxation, digging into the questions that have come up in the weeks, moving towards your yoga lab. So if you miss those longer periods of time and it's just not happening in your teaching schedule, plan for it, right? Have those moments. Because in a 20-minute class and a 30-minute class, what a lot of our students are doing online these days, are they getting an education in sun salutations? Or are they just flowing on, right? Are they ever getting a moment to pause and go, oh, if your shoulders don't feel comfortable in down dog, here's 4 or 5 things you can try, right? We often don't have time for that in express classes, so we have to plan that time with yoga labs or a class focused on hand positions, right? However you want to do that. If you miss those longer classes, which I do, plan for them. There's students out there who still want to do that. They just might not want to do it every day, right? It might not fit into their lifestyle in that way. So how can you plan for it? And if you're not sure what your students want, ask them. It gives you a chance to address things that you're seeing in class that students could use some help with. It gives you a chance to explore and play. It gives you some space to be curious about things. And I think that that's really valuable. It's valuable for you as a teacher. It's really valuable to your students. That's something that they can look forward to. Because they're not, especially students who are coming to mostly to these shorter classes, they're not getting an opportunity to receive an education in yoga, right? And so they're practicing, which is awesome, but like there's things that they could learn that could enhance their practice. There's things they could also be learning about philosophy and ethics of yoga. There's things they could be learning about breath work or mantra or mudra or meditation. And so yoga labs can be a way for you to do that. These days, people are so time poor. There's so many other activities that they're looking to do. And if yoga isn't the primary way that people are moving and meditating, you've got to find a way to fit into their lives. And 90-minute classes are probably not it for most people. They just can't commit that kind of time. Or if they can, they're the students who can only come once a week on the weekend when they can make that considerable space for yoga, right? So we need to find ways to bring yoga to the people, and shorter classes are a way to do that. And shorter classes are a way for students to have more frequency of practice, which to me is really important. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about FIT, F-I-T-T. And I come from a time in yoga where we had these really long, delicious classes where you got to explore so much of the practice, movement and breath work and meditation and intensity and depth of experience. Classes where you were looking at the clock like, how much longer is this class? Which, like, I don't get that experience anymore. But in this modern time, as I said, people are time poor, they're energy poor, and those 90 or 120-minute classes just aren't working for as many people, right? So when we talk about FIT, F-I-T-T, if you're in the fitness industry, you're quite familiar with this. If you're a fitness participant, you might have noticed how many fitness businesses that spell FIT with 2 T's, and why. FIT, refers to 4 principles of fitness: frequency, intensity, time, and type, right? Frequency, and this is how we sort of calculate volume of training. Frequency means how often you practice. And I will argue that frequency, when it comes to yoga, is the most important principle of your yoga practice. Better to practice shorter, less intense yoga sessions more often than wait all week to practice longer, more intense yoga sessions less often, right? And we'll talk about that more in a sec, but first, the other principles of fitness. I, intensity, refers to how you are challenged, which is important to your growth, right? To be challenged. So progressively intensifying your practice helps you to improve in areas like strength, flexibility, balance, endurance. Intensity can include factors like pace, holding poses longer, stronger poses, more complex movements, movements that have less support, or you're holding more of your body against the force of gravity. So think of all of our versions of chaturanga, for example. So that's intensity. Time, this is the duration of your practice. And I know I've literally just argued that frequency is more important than time, but I want to mention that there is something that happens after a certain length of time that feels magical and that brings a depth of experience. And to build stamina and endurance, you have to commit time, right? So again, planning for some longer, deeper sessions of yoga within your weekly or monthly practice schedule has great benefits so that you can work on that duration practice, right? Where am I at? Type. So the type of movements you do will result in comparable progressive overload. So if you're keen to get stronger through your yoga practice, you'll need to do the type of movements that build strength, like arm balancing, core strengthening, etc. If you're keen to build cardiorespiratory fitness, you'll need to do the type of movements that build that kind of fitness, like sun salutations, right? If you're keen to build your relaxation skills, you'll need to do the type of practice that develops this. So restorative poses, meditation, breath work. So when we think of type, we have to ask, if it's for my own practice, what are my goals? What am I looking to experience? And what are my aims here? Or if you're teaching, what are the goals of my students who are coming to my class, right? And that's how I'm going to make some of those choices. So in the fitness industry, we use FITT to calculate volume of training. So 30 minutes of practice 3 times a week, math, is the same as 15 minutes of practice 6 times a week. It's probably true. Don't trust my math skills, but you get my point, right? But with yoga, frequency is the most important factor. So better to do that 15 minutes 6 times a week than wait all week to do a 90-minute class. I don't think that added up. It did. Yeah. 30 minutes 3 times a week is the same as 15 minutes 6 times a week is the same as 90 minutes 1 time a week, right? I say do them all, but like people they're not practicing yoga as full-time practice, right? So we have to figure out ways to fit in. So again, to me, this is the most important factor in yoga. Less time more often is better than more time less often, right? And because it means not only are you having more regular movement in your life, which we know is really important for people's health and well-being, their mental health, right? Especially people who are sat at desks all day long. But also, more often, you're turning your focus to yoga. Instead of waiting all week to go to yoga and be like, I'm so self-aware now, have those moments, those shorter periods through the week where you can turn to self-awareness, where you can turn to your breath, where you can become present and mindful, where you can have self-care. So yoga, of course, isn't just about movement, right? It's about all these other factors. And when we have that frequency, when we have little tastes of yoga in our everyday life, I think it brings more yoga to our whole life, right? And that's going to go back to like intensity and type. So it depends on what you're doing. So you'll need rest and recovery time if you're working at an intensity that is challenging your muscles beyond their current capacity, right? So how do we get stronger? We challenge our muscles to the point that they suffer damage, and then our body sends in repair to build up those muscles bigger and stronger, right? If we're not doing that damage, we don't need as much recovery time, right? And one of the ways that we recover from having done that damage is by doing joint mobility, right? So complete rest between sessions of like heavy lifting, whether that's your body or weights, complete rest isn't the goal. That you want to do recovery movement, which is like joint mobilizations, easing through movements of the body rather than, obviously you're not doing heavy lifting every day, but you're not doing heavy lifting, nothing. Heavy lifting, nothing. You still have movement, right? Does that make sense? I think, especially if you're teaching yoga more as a career, or you have a community of students who are looking to develop their practice, having those yoga labs, yoga intensives, I think it's a really great addition to your teaching practice for a number of on a number of fronts. First of all, it is giving students that time to have an education in yoga, which they often miss in express classes, right? So they have, fortnightly, monthly, every few months, whatever, they have a chance to really look at poses and understand them and understand how they might approach those poses, right? What's the essence of the pose? What are some options for intensity, for alignment, for props, right? Some of your students really are hungry to know and explore. Some of your students are not. They just want to come, flow, rest, leave, right? So having these opportunities is great to take those students who are advancing in their yoga practice and give them that little bit more. as a teacher, you might also be really eager to share more philosophy. You might really be eager to share more meditation than 10% of your class time, right? You might be really eager to introduce students to new props, new poses, new sequences, new, mudras, bandhas. Like there's so much that we can miss out on teaching when we're teaching shorter classes. So I highly recommend it. I think it's a great way for you as a teacher to um, provide that education. I think it's a great way for you as a teacher to be creative and to challenge yourself. And I think it's a great opportunity for your students to enhance their practice. I love the idea of having community, because in shorter classes, students are also often whipping in, whipping out, and they're missing out on, or if they're studying online, often they miss out on the opportunity to have community. So if you have these yoga labs, whether you're teaching them face to face or you're teaching them virtually, have a cup of tea and a muffin after together. It gives students a chance to develop their yoga community. I really feel, I mean, maybe it's because like I'm really homebound these days. One of the things we miss out on these days in yoga is having community. Being my yoga practice is more than me, right? If it's just me, it's like navel gazing. It's got to include more people, right? And this is one of the things I love about my job is that I get to see yoga through your eyes. I get to experience yoga from your perspective. And it's so valuable. It's such a valuable thing to hear someone else's experience of yoga or someone else's perspective on yoga, on movement, on philosophy, on breath work, on meditation, on living a yoga life. And so having community time is one of our ways that we can do that, right? And it's going to bring so much value for you and so much value for your students. So I know we've talked about short classes, short classes, short classes. Now I'm all about long classes, but this is how we get the best of all worlds. We get frequency with shorter classes, and then we get intensity and time with having those regular longer classes. I think we get the best of both worlds. We give people a chance to look forward to something. If you really want to get elaborate with your yoga labs, make them half-day retreats or one-day retreats. You're going to help support a venue. You're going to help support someone who does the catering. You're going to invite more people into your yoga teaching practice. And you're going to help develop your own community as well as develop the community for your students, right? Yeah, it takes a little bit of extra work, but to me, it's worth it to have that opportunity to bring people together and to be creative and to challenge yourself and to plan something amazing, and to give your students that deeper, richer experience of yoga that they're maybe missing in those shorter classes, right? And again, let me say, you can do this face to face or you can do it virtually if you want to, right? And, a virtual yoga lab, yoga intensive, whatever you're going to call it. Yeah. And you can get students to send in their favorite muffin recipes to each other. Like you can find ways to make community by just thinking a little bit outside the box. And everyone wants to share their best muffin or scone recipe, right? Like I could give you 2 recipes right now. Amazing. It gives your students a chance to contribute as well, because when it comes to community, it's not you, the teacher, holding space and being responsible for everything. Community happens when everyone gets to contribute, when everyone gets to share, when everyone gets to hear and be heard. And so that's something to think about as well, right? And yeah, I think that, to me, I think it's time we think outside of the yoga box and outside of the me on my own, come into the studio, set up my mat, don't make eye contact, do my 45-minute express practice, roll up my mat, leave the class. I mean, it's fine. It's fine. But I think we're missing things when that's our only experience of yoga. So yeah, I wanted to talk about today.
Great.
Shorter classes can be amazing. They can encourage your students to have more frequency of yoga in their lives. It can help, which can help bring mindfulness and ease and self-awareness into their daily lives. Short classes can be well-rounded. They can still be rich experiences. They can still support your students in their aims for yoga. It just takes some thoughtful planning. It takes some time management. It takes some preparation to help you deliver complete yoga experiences in smaller packages, which hopefully will help our students um, participate more. It'll encourage accessibility. It'll make yoga more accessible. It'll encourage participation, and it gives you some creative ways to share yoga with others. So I look forward to hearing what you all do with all of this. Hello to those of you listening to the recording, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.